Okay, hi everyone. We're going through the life of the Buddha today. We're basically considering the narrative dimension to Buddhism. But before we start to unpack the life of the Buddha and before we consider his life in basic chronological order, I have two disclaimers for you. Number one, while we have lots of visual narratives and artworks that deal with, the narrative of the Buddha's life, we actually don't have any written material until about 500 years after his death, which means that for at least the first few centuries, the Buddhist narrative is essentially oral. Now, because it comes from an oral tradition, as you might expect, it's an imperfect narrative. There are certain things that are a problem or aren't necessarily a problem, but that we should be aware of. In particular, that depending on which time period and which culture you're getting your information from and even which thread of Buddhism, you might get a slightly different focus of Buddha's life. There are also some things which aren't explained and we don't have knowledge of. In other words, it's an imperfect chronological account of his life, but that's not really our concern. We don't need a perfect biography. All we need to do is consider how the life of the Buddha is embodied in the teaching, or how the teaching embodies his life. Another thing, while this narrative of the Buddha is almost certainly based on a real historical figure, someone that did exist, we're not here to sort of look specifically at the historical Buddha or divide the historical Buddha from mythical narrative. That's not our concern. Our concern is to understand, like I said, how this life story is embodied in the teaching. And that's our focus, how this narrative plays a role in Buddhism. Okay, now that we have those disclaimers out of the way, let's get started. Now, if we are going to look at the timeline that is the life of the Buddha, we're actually going to be doing this in two parts. So this video is actually going to be looking at the first half of his life. But when I say first half, I don't mean exactly, okay, we know the Buddha lived for so long, so we're going to be dividing it in half exactly by years. The divider is going to be based upon or is going to be based upon his enlightenment. So we're going to cut this video at the point in which the Buddha actually becomes the Buddha, because the Buddha is a term that means the enlightened one. This video is actually going to be concerned with all the moments prior to that. So when he is essentially a prince living a princely life, and when he is attempting to reach enlightenment. So when he is the Bodhisattva, when he is the Buddha to be. So essentially he was Prince Siddhartha before he was the Buddha, and that will be the focus of this video. So it's a part one. Now, let's go back to that timeline. Now, the first question here is where to start. And for most of you, that might seem like a really silly question, because the answer should be, of course, at the birth. But I didn't choose this arrow for no reason. Everything is chosen with great specificity, and that's because this little fuzzy bit at the front is actually quite important. When we consider the start of Buddha's life, we should actually go way before his birth, because according to Buddhist and, of course, Hindu tradition, Buddha existed many more times before his birth as Siddhartha and before he became the enlightened one. He lived thousands and thousands of lives, both as plants and as animals, continually going in this sort of cycle of death and rebirth, each time experiencing something new and trying to free himself more fully from ignorance and vice, to the point where he had reached some sort of state where he was able to be, or chose to be born, in order to achieve enlightenment for the good of people. Now, there are actually many different stories that recount Buddha's past lives, and while we're not going to focus on that too much, I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. So one example is when Buddha is, before he was Buddha, of course, in his past life, he encounters a lioness or a tigress, I don't remember, but essentially she is so starving that she is about to devour her own cubs. And seeing this, out of compassion, Buddha is moved to give up his own body so that she may devour him, so that she wouldn't have to go basically eat her own young. So these are the types of experiences that he had in his past lives that led him to be in the position to become the awakened one. Okay, so that's important to note. But let's now consider the actual conception and birth as Siddhartha working towards becoming the Buddha. Well, there are quite a miraculous sides to both his conception and his birth. According to tradition, his mother, which was the queen of a warrior caste community, was basically had a dream one night that a white elephant had strode towards her and entered her from her side. And from that point, it's sort of perceived as a virgin birth in the sense that while she was married to the king, she sort of refused to have sex from that point, and therefore she then bore the child. So in a loose context, this is actually a virgin birth. Now, the birth of the Buddha is also a little bit miraculous because he actually isn't born in a traditional way, but actually emerges from the side of his mother, which is very interesting. So we already see there are some facets of Buddha's nature that are already apparent here. In other words, while he is very, very human and his humanity is quite important to Buddhism and the teachings, it's also important to note that there are parts of his being or his nature which are superhuman or sort of not limited to, human parameters. Okay, so he's born from the side of his mother. When he is born, his father basically asks someone to explain what the life holds for his son, and this person comes with the prophecy that the child, Siddhartha, will either become a great ruler of men or be a great religious leader. So he will either sort of run an empire and be a king, or he will, help people towards a spiritual path. Now, the father, who of course is the king and his family is part of the warrior caste, of course desires the first one and desires his child to be a great political ruler and have lots of power. So basically tries to set up a world for him in which he is encouraged to desire power and not encouraged to consider, spirituality or, any existential questions. So he basically designs for him a life of pleasure. Siddhartha is actually is to have said, when I was a child, I was delicately brought up, most delicately. A white sunshade was held over me day and night to protect me from cold, heat, dust, and dew. So he basically lived a very princely life that was very, very sheltered. In fact, his father is said to have sort of constructed a temple for him in which all he saw was goodness and pleasure, and he had no real experiences of pain, so that he would not desire to live a spiritual life or, ask spiritual questions. So basically, in this palace, he gets married and he experiences all sorts of pleasure. And there is no sort of limitations to his reign of this good life. So for 29 years, he basically has enjoyment, almost 3 decades of just pure bliss. And then just before turning 30, that sort of all unravels for him and he starts to have a big sort of crisis. And that's when he leaves the palace. So he encounters 3 things that have a profound effect on him outside of the palace, outside of his father's control, that urge him to seek a religious life and realize that his life of enjoyment in his palace will not help him be happy, truly happy. So Siddhartha goes out in a chariot once with his companion, and he encounters a sick man, an old man, and eventually a corpse. And these sort of encounters deeply trouble Siddhartha, and he realizes that this is something that he too will once have to deal with and encounter: old age, sickness, and death. And this is a real problem for him, and he is moved to try and realize what the answer is to these questions. How do we deal with these problems if they are inevitable? How do we be happy despite them? Okay, so essentially what happens after that is he gets really deep in thought. And even though his wife actually ends up pregnant and he has a baby, he decides to take the path of an ascetic. He leaves his wife and his newborn son and decides to actually leave the compound, leave his life as a prince, leave the life of luxury, and go out to seek the answer to these deeply troubling questions that he had. And so he basically goes and he rides off on his trusted steed outside of the city walls and moves towards trying to seek something out in the wilderness. Interesting though, when he sort of leaves the palace, this is the first time that he is actually in which he encounters Mara, which is a demon of sort of desire and pleasure. And this demon sort of tries to stop him on his path and sort of urges him to stay, to enjoy that pleasure, to not give up, his right to rule. But Siddhartha actually goes past Mara and continues on his journey. Okay, so what he does, one of the first acts that he sort of does to sort of separate his life from princely life to the life of a religious man is he cuts off his hair and he takes off his priestly robes and he dons the robes of a beggar. And then he sends his horse and his companion back to the castle and basically assumes the life of a beggar, in which he survives on the charity of strangers. Now, as we've already talked about, he joins a community that's very flourishing because he's not the only one that's out there sort of seeking the answers to these questions. There are many different gurus and many different renunciants who are like him, who embrace poverty and self-discipline away from pleasure in order to realize higher truth. These are both men and women, and they were flourishing at the time, this movement where austerity and meditation was used in order to think about, okay, how are we going to escape this cycle of death and rebirth? It was a very big part of Indian civilization and religion, and it was a problem it was a problem which was seen to be overcome. So what then happened is that Siddhartha joined a few gurus where he was sort of learning how to, meditate and how to try and achieve inner peace. So one of the main things that he does after being with two gurus is that he joins a group of 5 which are all practicing different forms of extreme asceticism. In other words, they are practicing ways of not harming the body, but depriving the body in order to get some profound insight in their mind. He does attain some state of transcendence, but the problem for him is that it's not everlasting, and it doesn't really hold any permanent truths for the Buddha. So while he does spend some time with this community, it doesn't help him realize his goal. He decides to withdraw from food, and he ends up living on 1 grain of rice a day, and he becomes extremely skeletal. So he actually practices this asceticism for 6 years, and he subjects his body to extreme hardship and pain because the body represents a fundamental problem. Sickness, death, and old age are all things that emerge with the body. So he takes the requirements of survival to the bare minimum. And like I said, he eats 1 glass of rice per day. He sleeps on nails, stands on 1 foot. The body becomes extremely emaciated. So while he is in this position, he remembers the day when he was young, and he sort of realizes the perfection of that moment, and he gets this sort of insight into, I don't know, a higher truth. But at the same time, he realizes that it's not everlasting, and he sort of comes to realize that this is not for him. He ends up actually returning to eating when a woman offers him some rice or rice pudding, and he actually eats it gladly. This is an act of generosity which is celebrated in Buddhism, and it's an act of release for the Buddha. He sort of realizes that profound asceticism was not the answer. Neither was his life of pleasure. but neither was this other extreme. And so from that moment, he sort of moves away from the ascetic community, which are completely disgusted with his return to, normal eating and moving away from asceticism. And when he leaves them, he decides to sit under the Bodhi tree until he reaches enlightenment, which after a time, of course, he does. So here we're going to end, and this is like the first half of his life, where essentially he was a Buddha in the making who came from a series of thousands of past lives, born to discover a new truth. And although he discovers that by first experiencing true luxury and realizing that it does not free him from joy, from pain, but then also realizing that asceticism and extreme deprivation also does not free him from that pain. So he realizes that he stops seeking the truth from others and he turns within. He stops looking at gurus and other movements telling him how to achieve enlightenment, and he turns towards himself. And under the Bodhi tree, he seeks enlightenment, and there he becomes the Buddha. And we're going to be talking more about that and the second half of his life after he becomes this awakened one, and after he discovers the truth that become the tenets or the core tenets of Buddhism. Okay, guys, thank you for listening. Much more to discuss next lesson. I will see you all next Studies of Religion lesson.